Welcome back to the Situation Room, the weekly show that aims to act like Virgil, guiding Dante ever deeper into the inferno that is modern geopolitics, only without the hope that we'll ultimately get to paradise in the end. Cheery stuff. I'm Simon Whistler, and in this edition of Humanity's Not-So-Divine Comedy, we'll be answering your questions on the burning issues of the day, from what happened after the revolution in Bangladesh to whether the UN has finally outlived its usefulness. Big questions! First, though, a question that's going to be terrifying for us all, on which conflict is most likely to spill over into a vast regional war. Wow, we are hitting it hard today, aren't we? Kicking things off then, there's this one from Roger Marks 1454 who asks, as conflicts drag on, do any sources or your own intuition think that some could coalesce and form larger conflicts, or are the current conflicts compartmentalized enough to avoid a larger regional conflict? Thinking another step up from, say, the Gaza-Israel conflict to an escalated Israel-Iran conflict. Alright, to which our only answer can be yes, of course. We've been trying to warn people about this for literally years. The slightly less dramatic version, though, is that most conflicts do have the potential to expand in pretty weird and unexpected ways. What starts as the 2014 annexation of a peninsula eventually grows into the largest European land war since 1945, or an archduke getting shot in Bosnia winds up triggering a conflict so vast and all-consuming it becomes known as the First World War. But since the question references the Israel-Iran conflict, we're going to assume the question means current conflicts that have the ability to escalate into a wider regional showdown. In which case, we're sad to say that there are a couple that could easily do so. Now, the obvious one, that's Ukraine, where Putin's maximalist goals reputedly run the risk of sparking a far greater clash with the whole of NATO. But while it's the obvious one, the chances of Ukraine igniting a larger inferno may be smaller than most commonly think. Most of the main players are being hyper cautious about getting sucked into a wider conflict. For all he may be committed to playing the madman, there's a reason that Putin has backed down, as all of his red lines about supplying Ukraine with Western equipment have been crossed, because he is as terrified as Europe is of a continent-wide war that may end in nuclear Armageddon. Nobody wants that. The same, however, can't be said for another major conflict happening right now. In Sudan, the multiple outside backers of the opposing SAF and RSF seem so committed to escalation that the threat of spillover seems to grow every single day. Already, South Sudan has been so destabilized by the carnage in its northern neighbor that it almost slipped into its own civil war earlier this year. Some of the Sudanese armed factions, meanwhile, are linked to Tigrayan rebels in northern Ethiopia, where another conflict appears to be on the verge of kicking off. The war has also caused blowback in Chad and drawn in mercenaries from places like Libya and the Central African Republic. And then there are the nations backing those two sides. The United Arab Emirates is pouring insane amounts of money and equipment into keeping the genocidal RSF in the game, with additional help from nations like Chad, Ethiopia, and even Kenya. The SAF, meanwhile, are being backed by Russia and Iran and are forging growing links with Islamist groups. Basically, it feels like a situation where a bunch of middle powers have seen the huge advantages that could come from dominating Sudan's post-war future, either through access to gold mines, the Red Sea coast, or just through wielding political power, and none feels that they have any reason to back off. And while the chances of, say, Russia and UAE coming to blows over Sudan is just laughably small, there is a much greater chance that the war could not just spill over, but merge with brewing conflicts in places like South Sudan and northern Ethiopia to create a kind of omni-war rolling across the Horn of Africa. And yet, almost nobody seems to be talking about this. Just Sudan experts, local activists, and weirdos like us who just can't get over how really fucking strange it is that one of the defining conflicts of our time is just being ignored. Big trouble in Bangladesh. But in Cereal Box says, what has happened in Bangladesh since the ouster of Sheikh Hasina? It was all over the news and now there is nothing. Will the new powers in Bangladesh take a more active role in Myanmar as Rohingya continue to live in and move to refugee camps in Bangladesh, particularly as no side in Myanmar seems to want them? Okay, just a little bit of background before we answer the question. A bit over a year ago, popular protests in Bangladesh overthrew the country's longtime dictator, Sheikh Hasina, who fled to neighboring India and has been living in exile there ever since. After the fall of the Hasina regime, an interim government took over control of Bangladesh under the leadership of an economic activist and Nobel laureate named Muhammad Yunus. On the positive end, the outlook for Bangladesh today is undoubtedly brighter than it was under Hasina's leadership. Unfortunately, that doesn't mean that the past year has been kind to Bangladesh or its people. The successes of the Yunus government have been impressive to behold. So far, the nation has avoided economic collapse despite Hasina's inner circle and elites looting the banks as they left power, and Bangladesh has become a site of major foreign financial investment. After months of consternation and complaints that he was moving too slowly, Yunus recently announced nationwide elections to be held next February. They've kick-started political reforms and kept the state bureaucracy from caving in, which, to their credit, is no small feat. They've balanced relations with the US and China, and 1 year later, the mood in Bangladesh is still optimistic enough that the anniversary of Hasina's overthrow was cause for celebration and not riots. At the same time, Yunus and his government have faced criticism for what's been perceived as a lax approach to members of the old regime, failing to aggressively prosecute those who supported Hasina or profited from her dictatorship. They've been unable to produce quick results, investigating forced disappearances and extrajudicial executions. Religious hardliners still play an outsized role in civil affairs, despite a large portion of the nation hoping to see their influence curtailed, and mob violence has become a regular occurrence. As for the Rohingya, refugee camps in Bangladesh continue to swell as more and more people pour over the border from Myanmar. But as for whether Bangladesh will take a more active role in Myanmar's conflict, what are they to do? Bangladesh has minimal international clout, its own state structure is weak, and it's in no position to intervene militarily. Plus, the Myanmar conflict is firmly within China's purview, and if Bangladesh is going to continue positive relationships with China, then taking action in Myanmar would be the worst possible course of action. Right now, the Rohingya refugee population in Myanmar numbers 1.2 million, and it does not appear that they'll be getting a chance to return home anytime soon. Crimean Dreams. Hunter Miller I8I asks, why have the Ukrainians consistently struck radar and missile defense systems in Crimea? It appears they are not going to attempt a large-scale offensive in the direction anytime soon. Wouldn't those strikes be more effective at destroying energy infrastructure in Russia or ammo storage in occupied Ukraine? And the answer to this one, well, it comes in 3 separate parts: logistics, air defense, symbolism. Control of the Black Sea used to also be a major part of the answer, but combat in the Black Sea has mostly died down at this phase in the war. Now, despite what we'd expect to be vehement disagreement from Ukraine supporters, we agree with the assessment that a Crimea offensive almost certainly isn't in the cards, and that, unfortunately, it's not likely that Crimea will return to Ukrainian control. But keeping pressure on the isthmus serves a number of purposes for Kiev anyway. On logistics, Crimea is an important waypoint for weapons, ammunition, supplies, and heavy warfighting equipment headed to southern Ukraine, where Russia is contesting control of multiple Ukrainian oblasts. Hit those supply routes, and Ukraine can inhibit Russia's warfighting ability, with a chance that it could even hit some particularly important assets. Then there's the symbolic aspect, where Crimea has been a central part of Putin's wartime mythology since before it was annexed in 2014. We could spend a really long time going over all the details here, but suffice it to say that in Putin's telling, Crimea takes on an almost religious significance for his version of a great, powerful Russian state. In that sense, Ukraine attacks Crimea because Crimea is important to Russia, plain and simple. Finally, on air defenses, because Russia invests symbolic meaning in Crimea and runs logistical supply routes through that territory, it's got to protect Crimea from aerial attack. Russia is dealing with an air defense shortage. It's losing its defensive batteries faster than they're being replaced, and as its air defenses stretch thinner and thinner, more targets become exposed while the remaining batteries themselves become vulnerable. If Ukraine simply didn't attack Crimea, then the air defense systems on the isthmus could be repurposed and sent elsewhere. But as long as Ukraine keeps up the pressure, Russia is forced to deconcentrate its air defenses even further. As one last note, we should mention that although Ukraine does have limited resources, its limitations are a lot less severe when attacking a target as close to Crimea. If Ukraine wants to hit, let's say, Moscow or targets even past that, then it has to be careful about rationing the munitions to make those attacks happen. Crimea, however, is a target where Ukraine can expend types of munitions that it can spare. Efficiency is still important, but not quite as much as it would be for other types of weapons. Disunited nations. And now, a rather spicy one from Gary Devine 605. Do we accept that the UN is essentially pointless now, or is it doing exactly what it was designed to do, namely making dialogue possible? Now, this is a question that gets asked on a lot of geopol shows, mainly because you could argue that what appears to be horrific dysfunction is in fact merely a sign that the UN is allowing nations to blow off steam in constructive ways rather than nuking each other from orbit. But let's be real, the days when the UN had any sway over the leaders of the world is long gone. Rather than solving problems, the United Nations has instead become a source of woeful gridlock. As an example, let's look at Haiti, where pretty much everybody agrees that the ongoing meltdown has reached such a crisis point that someone is going to have to intervene. Since most local powers, from the USA to Brazil, are currently all like, no thank you very much, you'll think that this would be the platonic ideal of a UN peacekeeping mission. Especially since the then government of Haiti called for intervention in autumn 2022. Instead, talks to send a mission moved at such a glacial pace that armed gangs had overthrown that government and seized most of Port-au-Prince by the time it got underway. Even then, all the Security Council would authorize was a Kenyan-led police deployment, one that has so far failed to contain the violence. The reason for this is the weird politics of the Security Council. Now, there are 5 veto-wielding members: France, Britain, Russia, China, and the United States. Of those, France and Britain haven't utilized their veto since 1989. That means almost all crises today come down to a dumb game where Russia and China will kill anything that the US might want, such as a UN intervention for stabilizing Haiti, while the US will kill anything related to Palestine or Gaza. As a result, the last decade has seen a grand total of 1 peacekeeping mission authorized: the underfunded, under-equipped, and under-supported Kenyan police deployment to Haiti. Nor are many of the UN's 11 active legacy missions going particularly well. Sure, you've got some, like Cyprus and Kosovo, where the president's blue helmets probably contributes to a fragile peace, but other deployments read like a where's where guide to global danger zones: South Sudan, Central African Republic, DRC. There's also a UN force in southern Lebanon that resolutely failed to stop a short, sharp war last year between Israel and Hezbollah. Is the answer, therefore, to give up on the entire concept of the UN and return to a world of might is right? No, of course not. Not unless you want more conflict breaking out. But it seems clear that the UN, as currently constituted, cannot go on. The Security Council likely needs serious reform to reflect the current makeup of the world. It seems pretty bizarre that fading former colonial powers like France and Britain and the dysfunctional gas station with nukes known as Russia wield vetoes, while the European Union, India, and Brazil, to take just 3 examples, all don't have a say. In fact, we probably need to ditch the veto system altogether and move to some sort of qualified majority voting format. And there need to be better enforcement mechanisms for the vanishingly rare times when the Council does agree. In 2024, a joint resolution calling for a Ramadan ceasefire in Sudan was ignored by all warring parties, and there were 0 consequences. Yet, even these changes might not make a difference because they would require buy-in from all of the world's most powerful nations. Buy-in that we are unlikely to get. Right now, we seem to be entering an era where international norms are so broken that leaders are realizing they can just go grab territory and dick all is gonna happen. And while this presents serious risks over the medium and long term, too many of those in charge are instead seeing short-term opportunities to seize what they can. In other words, we seem to be unlearning the lessons of the 20th century, which does not bode well for the future. And so, WarFronts seems destined to grow at the expense of humanity as a whole, sliding deeper into the abyss. Sorry, guess we shouldn't have wished on that monkey's paw for the channel to succeed. Our bad. Explaining the National Guard. The Dragon Demands asks, for an international audience, explain how the US National Guard works, how they answer to state governors, not the federal government, posse comitatus, and at a glance, the total National Guard numbers in red states versus blue states. The Dragon Demands. You ask that question like a fucking ChatGPT, bro. And I will oblige with less hallucinations. We're going to call in our resident American to answer this one, and Evan, the city of Boston's own, says, the National Guard's a tricky thing to understand because, on the one hand, it's a major part of the US military, comprising about 430,000 troops at any given time. Simultaneously, those troops are beholden not just to the federal government in Washington, but to individual states. So, for example, there's a Texas National Guard and a California National Guard, and so on and so forth. For that reason, the National Guard can be called upon by the US military to serve in foreign deployments, and quite often National Guard contingents will rotate to American military bases and even active war zones. But the portion of a state's National Guard that remains on American soil can be activated to deal with major domestic concerns by their state's governor. That might include disaster relief efforts, riots, public health events like the COVID pandemic, etc. What the US military cannot do, in most cases, is to fill functions of civilian law enforcement. If a city is dealing with a crime wave, for example, then it would generally be illegal for a state's governor or the federal government to direct the National Guard to start making arrests and doing the job of civilian law enforcement. That's a rule established in the Posse Comitatus Act back in the 1870s. That said, there are exceptions to the rule if, for example, a city or state is dealing with mass unrest, riots that have gotten too big for law enforcement to control, or even an insurrection. Then, state governors can deploy them as such. In the case of an insurrection, they can also be nationalized by the president, who assumes direct command of the National Guard in a given state for as long as the threat of insurrection is ongoing. But in Washington, D.C., it's a bit more tricky, since Washington isn't part of any state and is instead administered directly by the federal government. As such, it's easier for the president to deploy the DC National Guard for short periods without needing congressional approval for up to 30 days. And for the president, there are other loopholes to consider. Essentially, the president can declare that there's an insurrection, basically arbitrarily, and while a state governor could refuse to comply and hand over control of the National Guard or could challenge that declaration in court, Washington, D.C. doesn't have any mechanism to contest the National Guard's deployment. The president can also do what's starting to happen now and get friendly governors of friendly states to hand over National Guard control to the president so that those federalized National Guard troops can more easily be sent into states or cities that don't agree that a Guard deployment is necessary. The governors of Ohio, South Carolina, Louisiana, and several other states are testing out that theory right now, sending their troops to deploy into Washington, and if the legal theory holds up, they may be deployed to other cities across the United States sooner rather than later. End of NATO. MTG Bear asks us, is NATO on its way out? It seems like the coalition of the willing is more practical, and it circumvents Putin's claims of NATO advancement if the alliance were destroyed and reforged. That's an interesting way of looking at the situation, Mr. Bear. And to an extent, it does seem like the coalition of the willing that's taking shape right now is going to be a more potent geopolitical tool than NATO ever was. But rather than NATO being on its way out, we'd offer that the NATO alliance has fallen into the same trap for decades, in assuming that because the NATO alliance exists, it's no longer necessary or justifiable to put together different coalitions to accomplish different tasks. Perhaps there is some geopolitical word out there to describe this already, but if we were going to describe it ourselves, we'd opt for the phrase creativity blindness. The world is a rapidly changing place. Every member of NATO has to navigate their place in the world separately, and it's okay for novel problems to be addressed through novel solutions. But world leaders, especially the leaders of Europe, love a pre-existing bureaucratic institution, and whenever new problems have cropped up, NATO member nations have chosen to defer to the NATO alliance and quite often pass problems off to the United States if NATO can't or doesn't want to offer a solution. Hopefully, the decision to create a coalition of the willing can be a wake-up call to the members of NATO, because for decades there have been crisis after crisis and problem after problem where a subgroup of well-equipped militaries could have collaborated and found a way to step up. With any luck, the combination of European rearmament, diminished American reliability, and the threat of an expansionist Russia will be enough to help NATO members find their brains as well as their spines. But NATO will always be there in the background, offering a collective defense pact, overseeing military interoperability, and filling lots of other important functions that don't have to be ignored, just because NATO members finally admit that their alliance isn't an omni-tool solution to every single problem. General tomfoolery. No alarms and many surprises. Chris Pontius asks us, after a few years building this channel, what has surprised the team the most? Ooh. Evan's going first. I've been pleasantly surprised by the fact that we've been able to pivot into covering global conflicts, especially underreported ones, and we've had this much success. Indeed, it's nice, Evan, isn't it? Compared to the trends in larger traditional media companies, we are swimming against the current. They're having less success covering global conflicts and covering those conflicts less frequently, while we're having more success and covering them more frequently. And really, I think it's a testament to the audience. That's you guys that our approach has worked. Quite frankly, we respect you. Indeed we do, Evan. I'm just chiming in Evan's answer. I'm sorry. I get my own answer in a second. We believe that you're capable of holding nuance and complexity in your head, and that you're capable of paying attention to something for 15 or 30 or even 60 minutes because you're curious and interested in fully understanding the subject. That's something that large media groups just don't seem to offer anymore, or if they do, they offer it exclusively in written format, buried at the bottom of their websites. So given the way that foreign affairs coverage is going, I'm surprised that a channel like this can be successful at all, because if you only paid attention to how legacy media handles this sort of coverage, you'd think it was physically toxic. But when I look at the fact that we invest time and careful consideration, and most importantly, trust into our audience, it does make all the sense in the world. Morris is next up. I think the thing that surprises me most are the relationships we've managed to build with a small handful of real experts who seem to be almost envious of the way we can regularly mix reporting with both irreverence and the ability to straight up tell nations who are trying to sue us to go f*** themselves. Somalia. Oh, Morris says I won't embarrass them by naming names. I will, Morris. I will. But we've made contacts with people at respected think tanks in the armed forces of certain nations, and with award-winning reporters who just seem to love the fact that we have no barrier to being able to tell directly to nations. Something like X nation is a human rights fucking nightmare, and we hope its leader one day drowns in a pile of shit. My pet theory is that the current media and diplomatic landscape feels so anodyne and overly careful that just by being able to call a spade, or in this case a piece of shit, while still knowing what the heck we're talking about, we're bringing something refreshing to people. I would say that it's nice. God, my answers are so less well prepared. I'm sorry. I just think it's nice that this is a YouTube channel that is made by a few people from different places in the world, and we managed to make a dent in what I thought was quite a crowded space. That, like Evan was saying, there's giant companies covering this stuff, and I thought, how do you compete with that? But I'm just repeating Evan's answer, but I think it's just trust and not treating people like they're dumb. Or that they just want to headline stuff. There are people who don't just want to headline stuff, and thank you for being those people. Yeah, that's it. That's me. Bird is the word. Given the results of the Australian emu war, God, this comes up so often, which other animals would humans embarrass themselves by going to war against? I'll go first. That gorilla thing. That gorilla thing was so stupid. You guys follow this? Where it's like, okay, who would win? A gorilla or a gorilla versus 100 men? And the answer is really simple. If it's 100 men on one gorilla all at once, the men win. No question. But if it's a gorilla with one man going at a time, then the gorilla wins. What's so hard about this? Evan, I don't care whether we'd win. I don't care whether we'd lose. We need to go to war against lampreys. Immediately. What's a lamprey? Awful mouths. All right. What's a lamprey? Oh, Jesus Christ. Oh, Jesus Christ. I did not need to know that was a thing. Evan, why do you know about this? Why does this exist? Morris says, this is going completely against the spirit of the question, but back when this was still a history channel, I wrote a script on the Emu War, and it was genuinely a shock to discover how much misery was behind it. The farmers who were having their crops ruined were World War I veterans who'd fought for their country in bloodbaths like Gallipoli, then returned to be cast aside by a government that gave less than zero shits about them. At the time, they were growing wheat at a loss because the government had cancelled their subsidies, and the entire adventure to fight the emus seems to have just been the Australian government hoping it could reverse the bad PR by machine gunning a bunch of flightless birds. To be honest, in a better world, the Emu War would have ended with the downtrodden veterans joining forces with the emus to overthrow the government. That didn't happen, and it makes me sad. Where in the world? What places would you most like to visit but probably never can because of war or politics? Morris! As someone who has repeatedly called Abiy Ahmed a war criminal, I suspect going to Ethiopia would be a really bad idea. And that's before we even mention the ongoing insurgency in the Amhara region or the likelihood of a return to war in Tigray. And yet I can't help but feel it must be a wonderful place to see. There seems to be so much history crammed into this one space, from the rock-hewn Christian churches to the traces of ancient Jewish communities to footprints preserved in rock that are millions of years old. Throw in some more inspiring landscapes, and I imagine this would be an incredible place to experience. Evan says, Unfortunately, I don't think it would be a good idea for any of us right now, but I'd love to go to China. Despite all the repression and the geopolitical side of things, every person I've ever talked to who's paid a visit agrees that the country is genuinely incredible in its own way. It's got dozens of vibrant cities, a fascinating history, unbelievable natural wonders, and most importantly, 1.4 billion people who I wish I could get to know. I'll tack on a little bit. I've been to China twice, and it's a fantastic place to visit. It's fascinating. The cities are unbelievably massive. The people are just so friendly and nice. And I don't know, I've known Chinese people outside of China as well. It's always just super nice. So, yeah, just a shame about the politics, I guess. Also, I'd love to go to Transnistria for a while. I'm sure it'd be a mind-altering experience. It's a bit grim right now, though. As for me, Simon's turn. I'd quite like to... My sister moved out to the UAE for work a couple of years ago, and I don't think I can go visit. I've talked too much. But I'd like to go see her. We see each other when we're in the UK together, but yeah, it's a bit of a shame. TV recommendations, all right. Sam3 Drinks. What TV show or movies have you guys enjoyed lately? Morris. I just watched the first season of One Punch Man. It remains, even now, 10 years after it first aired, one of the best looking shows ever produced. I have no idea what this is. Is this I have a feeling this might be anime? The fight scenes still have the unmatched kinetic energy, and the story of Saitama, a superhero so strong that his life has become devoid of meaning and challenge, is a great example of a one-note joke fleshed out into a genuine pop culture icon. It's just a shame about season 2. Evan says, I'm trying to catch up on all the critically acclaimed shows of the 2000s and 2010s because I haven't seen most of them, and I'm sick of being out of the loop. Right now, though, I'm halfway through Boardwalk Empire, in which Steve Buscemi carves a very gory path through the American Prohibition era in Atlantic City. Before that, I watched The Sopranos, and now I understand that I've been missing out. As for me, mostly lately I've been just watching Love Island. Not really. I've been watching Archer, though. You guys watch Archer, the cartoon? I don't know how old it is, but it's definitely a little bit old because, the main spy agency in it is called ISIS. And they're always like, we're going back to ISIS. I think they changed it in later seasons, apparently. But I enjoy that. It's extremely funny. Thanks for watching.